10,000 miles from the United States, below the tip of South America on the Antarctic continent, lies South Pole City, one of the man-made miracles of the air age. Through the magic of a bridge of airplanes, a tiny city now exists direct South Pole. It is officially the Amundsen-Scott International Geophysical Year South Pole Station. These buildings house a group of 18 scientists and U.S. Navy men and the food and equipment they need to stay alive and work in cold that sometimes reaches 100 degrees below zero. South Pole City is the key installation of a vast scientific effort in Antarctica during 1957 and 1958. It ties in with a worldwide program of scientific research being undertaken by more than 60 nations. The Antarctic bases, and especially the South Pole Station, will be indispensable in weather prediction and the probing of cosmic rays, magnetism, and other mysteries of outer space. Because of airdrops by airplanes, men can live and work at the pole in relative comfort. During the early construction period in November 1956, there was some doubt as to the completion of the project. Everything required for the polar city, buildings, fuel, and food, had to be dropped by plane. By December 1956, the situation at the pole became critical. Even though the C-124s, the 90-ton Globemasters of the most frigid airlift, less than half of the required supplies were delivered because of bad weather conditions at the McMurdo base. Although the polar party had received a tractor, a generator, and fuel, supplies were insufficient to last out the winter. Dr. Paul Seipel, scientific leader of South Pole City, had radioed that the settlement would have to fold up if supplies were cut off. It wasn't the weather at the pole station that was raising trouble, but weather back at the C-124 on the edge of the Antarctic continent. Strangely enough, the weather was too warm, not too cold or stormy. It was melting the surface of the ice runway. At the Naval Air Facility, the town at McMurdo, servicemen knew that the summer melting was making the ice rough and too thin. The officers and men of the C-124 outfit, the 63rd Troop Carrier Wing, were concerned that the whole floating airfield might break loose and drift out to sea. The radio waves between McMurdo and the polar station and between McMurdo and another outpost called the Byrd IGY station were jammed with frantic traffic. Both outposts depended on the C-124s for survival. If the aerial supplies were cut off, they couldn't get through the Antarctic summer, and especially the long, unbroken winter night which would follow. It was considered evacuating the men at both bases. If this was done, the American scientific work in Antarctica would be slowed almost to a standstill. Admiral George Dufek, Task Force Commander, was faced with a grave decision. General C.E. McCarty, commanding the 18th Air Force, flew down from home base in South Carolina to see what could be done. Men like McCarty and Dufek had overcome similar challenges in the forbidding polar regions before. Back in 1946-47, after World War II, Antarctic exploration had moved into the big league. The war had provided the wherewithal on a big scale, ships, vehicles, bigger and faster planes. Admiral Dufek, then a Navy captain, and scientist Paul Seipel were high-ranking commanders. For Operation Highjump, the biggest Antarctic operation ever undertaken, 13 ships and 4,700 men were used. Also, the workhorse transport plane of World War II, the DC-3, provided supplies in quantity. The Navy called it R4D. On the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Philippine Sea, 4 such planes were being prepared for Antarctica. 2 more were ready below deck. Jet-assisted takeoff, a World War II invention, got the planes into the air. Admiral Byrd, a veteran of the very early Antarctic expeditions, flew the first R4D in the unprecedented flight from the carrier deck. These were the largest aircraft ever from a carrier at that time. Our Antarctic explorers, including Admiral Byrd, were learning about polar air operations at an accelerated rate. Danger, too, accelerated with the speed and size of the operation. 2 men, a pilot and a naval officer, were rescued unhurt after this helicopter crashed. The naval officer was Admiral, at that time Captain Dufek. The PBM George I was a Navy mapping plane, one of many exploring the vast Antarctic continent. It taught us one of our hard lessons, not to fly in weather called whiteout. George I became one of our casualties, a bad one. The plane had flown into a whiteout, a polar weather phenomenon in which sky and land merge, and men lose all sense of depth perception. 3 men died in the crash. 6 were rescued. The bulk of heavy supplies for Operation Highjump had to be carried by ship, the hard way. This was before the advent of the C-124, the supply ship of the air. Supply ships were lost, but the fragile steel hulls were no match for the formidable ice pack. The hard school of danger taught lessons even in simple matters like how to rig a new type of breeches buoy in Antarctic seas. That passenger was the then Captain George Dufek. Durable Dufek survived 7 minutes in the freezing water. On the Antarctic continent, the men of Operation Highjump gained vital know-how about flying under South Polar conditions. Here Admiral Byrd takes off again for the South Pole. Admiral Byrd, flying over the pole, drops a box containing United Nations flags. The R4Ds and PBMs had done yeoman work photographing and charting 1.5 million square miles of Antarctic continent. In 1951, 4 years after Operation Highjump, the giant new C-124 came into military use. When the Korean War broke out, the C-124 became one of the mainstays of our aerial freight line. Some of these Korean airlift planes were under the command of a dynamic Air Force general named McCarty. When a great wall of radar stations, the $500 million dew line, was built across North America in the Arctic, the C-124s were just what the doctor ordered. The 18th Air Force under General McCarty dropped 9,000 tons of construction material and supplies to the building crew. The 3,000-mile radar station, designed to give the United States early warning of enemy attack, was a modern-day miracle. The United States, about to launch a great 3-year scientific program in Antarctica, Through the Navy began a study of dew line and the capabilities of the Globemaster, the C-124. As our new Antarctic Armada plowed south in January 1956, the Air Force and Navy planned another scientific miracle. An air base would be built on ice at the edge of the Antarctic continent at McMurdo Sound. From there, C-124s would fly building materials to be dropped right at the South Pole. To support the 90-ton weight of a loaded C-124, at least 13 to 15 feet of ice would be required at the McMurdo Sound base. The bulldozers scraped and leveled the 6,000-foot runway. To provide gasoline to the C-124s and other aircraft, 2 Navy tanker barges were left frozen in the ice near the McMurdo base. They carried 500,000 gallons of fuel. 4,000 tons of freight were hauled by the tractors, including over 700 tons, later to be dropped on the pole by the C-124s. The primitive town at McMurdo began to take shape. It was named Williams Air Operating Facility for a Navy tractor driver who drowned when his vehicle fell through the ice. The 13,000-foot high Mount Erebus, an active volcano, looked down on the building activities at McMurdo. So did the Penguins, as their ancestors had watched early explorers, Scott, Shackleton, and Amundsen, 50 years before. Some of the old, reliable equipment of the early explorers persisted at McMurdo and Little America. Amid tractors and airplanes, dog sleds were still the most dependable method of moving from A to B for short distances. But the modern equipment was beginning to arrive too, like the DC-4s, known to the Navy as R-5Ds. Back in New Zealand, the first C-124 outfit, the 52nd Troop Carrier Squadron, had flown in from the States. They had flown 10,000 miles from home base in Greenville, South Carolina. The 52nd, a part of the 18th Air Force, welcomed long-range assignments like this one. They proved that heavy air freighters could be moved anywhere in the world on a few hours' notice. More C-124s came in from South Carolina, carrying men and operating equipment. From New Zealand, they would have to haul 2,250 miles to McMurdo. And from McMurdo, another 735 miles to the pole. Colonel Horace Croswell, commanding officer of the C-124 outfit, made his plans at Harwood Airport near Christchurch, New Zealand. And 300 airmen of the 52nd Squadron, 63rd Wing, came to know a new and hospitable home. The long, bright land of the Maoris was a far cry from the searing cold of the Antarctic. The lucky maintenance men could stay there. But the flying and loading crews had to be on their way. The plan was to use the McMurdo ice strip as a way station en route to the pole, to fly back to New Zealand for maintenance. 4,500 miles for a grease job. The big planes would carry a full load of freight to McMurdo. Also the men of the aerial port unit who would handle the loading at McMurdo. Aboard the first flight was Dr. Paul Seifel, slated to be the mayor of South Pole City. He was a veteran of 5 previous Antarctic expeditions with Admiral Byrd. McMurdo Sound, the new ice surface was a bit rough here and there. And some of the landings were not exactly smooth. The pilots checked later and found there were 3-foot dips in the ice runway. 2 emergencies beset the expedition that first day. A Navy P-2V had just crashed near the runway, killing 4 crewmen, leaving 2 seriously injured. Colonel Croswell made a quick turnaround and flew the injured back to New Zealand. and the nose gear of one of the C-124s collapsed upon hitting a bad pothole. A hurry call was radioed to California to bring down special technicians to repair the damaged gear and the cargo door. Another emergency vital to the polar station. Bad weather had barred reconnaissance flights to the pole, so no one knew the condition of the snow on which the South Pole city was to be set up. While the stockpile at McMurdo grew, weather over the 2-mile-high polar plateau continued bad. General McCarty, anxious to get his C-124 airlift going, hopped the 10,000 miles from South Carolina to New Zealand to make a personal checkup. McCarty decided to fly down to McMurdo and find out for himself what could be done to break the logjam in the operation. He flew to McMurdo, was warned about a dangerous whiteout condition, but loaded 10,000 pounds of fuel oil and an automatic weather station, which would be the first freight drop on the South Pole. The general took off, carrying a party of trained observers. He outwitted the whiteout by flying over it. The weather over the polar plateau was fine. The snow surface conditions could be clearly observed. It was determined that the surface was suitable for ski landings. McCarty's successful flight also set in motion regular C-124 trips to the pole with scientific and technical observers and airdropped cargo. Admiral Dufek was now able to send the first party of construction men and scientists to the pole in a ski-equipped C-47. And Admiral Dufek was about to try the first landing at the South Pole, October 31st, 1956. He would have the assist of JATO bottles to boost him off the ice on the return trip. Only the lightest load could be carried on the R-4D to the pole. Because the polar plateau was 2 miles high, the air was thin, and the runway was rough. A few at a time, scientists and construction men were flown in by Navy R-4Ds. Among the first was Dr. Paul Seipel, one of Admiral Byrd's protégés. Other early passengers ferried in by R-4Ds were the reliable sled dogs. But the really heavy stuff had to be dropped from the C-124s. Big items, a generator, a tractor, weighing as much as 8 tons each. Some of the polar camp began to take shape, like this radio antenna. But there was still trouble. Men running out to retrieve a parachute bundle came back empty-handed. The cargo parachutes weren't opening properly. Colonel Croswell decided to send a parachute expert to the polar station. He was Tech Sergeant Richard Patton, a trained parachute jumper. Three times Patton took off. 3 times the plane was turned back by weather. It couldn't land at the pole. At last, Patton got permission to land at the polar station the way he thought most dependable, by parachute. On November 25th, from a C-124, Sergeant Patton bailed out over the pole. at the pole, Patton checked over the defective cargo chutes. He found that they should be packed differently for the 30 to 55 degrees below zero temperatures. He passed the word by radio. The new packing methods paid off. A high degree of efficiency was reached. With stepped-up airdrops, construction picked up again at the polar city. The Seabees and scientists at the pole were encouraged. But back at McMurdo, the C-124 pilots began to feel the icy runway deteriorating beneath them. With the warmer weather of the Antarctic summer, the ice was beginning to melt, and bad cracks had developed. Daily helicopter flights were made to scout the condition of the ice in McMurdo Sound. Bulldozer crews labored hard to level the dips in the runway. The useful runway surface was shrinking from 6,000 to 4,000 feet. Dr. Seipel, mayor of the polar city, was told of the danger to the runway. He reported that the station didn't yet have enough supplies and building materials to last through the coming Antarctic winter. Unless the freight drops were continued, he would have to abandon the polar station, the key to our whole scientific effort. The decision made was a stepped-up schedule of freight drops by the C-124 men. The big planes began to run 3 drops a day onto the polar positions. Up the drops, some less fragile items like lumber were dropped from low altitudes without parachutes. Building activity at the pole continued at an accelerated pace. Most important, enough fuel oil had been dropped to last through the vicious winter. When an R-4D from McMurdo flew in to make a check on the conditions of South Pole City, the South Pole residents had good news. Seipel thought they could make it through the winter, provided a few more drops could be made. The good news was just in time, for the gasoline supply at McMurdo was getting low, and the runway had melted down to 3,000 feet, dangerously short. Colonel Croswell, commanding the C-124 wing, decided his outfit must withdraw to New Zealand. When the Antarctic fall weather came in late February, the ice would be firmer and the Navy would have brought in another tanker full of gasoline. Admiral Dufek agreed. At the McMurdo Chapel, men prayed that the plan would work out. And so in February, the C-124s once again left Land's End in New Zealand to finish the job. They took off again from McMurdo Sound, loaded to capacity. And so the job was done. The most difficult airlift had come to pass, and South Pole City was firmly established. And the men of the airlift heard with pride the radiogram sent by Admiral Dufek to the Secretary of Defense. This operation has undoubtedly been the most unique, difficult and dangerous of any peacetime air support mission in history. The planning, organization, and conduct of the operation so outstanding that they, the 63rd Troop Carrier Command Wing, are deserving of peacetime award that can be given to them.